Blacksmith, Stables, Longhouses, we push the new Rohan house kits to the limit as we check out some complex designs. Welcome to Zorpazorp Gaming, my name's Lachlan Linton-Keane, and welcome to the second installment of our Rohan Terrain series. In part 1, we had a look at the basic assembly of the new plastic kit, the Rohan House from Games Workshop. Today we're going to be really thrashing that kit and pushing it to its limits, creating some fantastic designs at lots of different scales and sizes, using some traditional techniques as well as, kind of bashing the kits into doing things they weren't completely intended to do. There is a whole lot of possibility with this wonderful detailed plastic, and we can make a fantastic looking city out of it. We're going to be making 4 buildings today, which serve as a bit of a case study, exploring some new techniques that you guys can use at home to adapt your own designs or even follow along these builds and get a really great looking cityscape. We're going to be relying on basically 2 main design principles, and that's manipulating the floor plan of the buildings and manipulating the roof line. And by changing those 2 things, we can create some really interesting, dynamic, playable buildings that are fantastic, not just for display, but also for wargaming. We're going to be bashing these kits and making them even more playable than they are out of the box. Now, the Rohan Longhouse is sort of the most obvious leaping off point for people who want to start expanding and building bigger buildings using multiple kits. This is simply a nice long building that takes 2 houses and puts them end to end with a little bit of extra detail. So what we're going to do is put a bit of a twist on that to give you a really unique longhouse that's really great for gaming and looks absolutely awesome. What I'm actually going to do with this building, rather than starting with the footprint, is we're going to build the roof line first. So to build this elongated roof and to combine multiple roofing sheets is really easy. So I've lined up all my roofing parts here, and if you'll remember from the first video that we have the roof plates which have the thatch, and our big timber braces just glue onto the ends of these thatch pieces using a tongue and groove. Now, the wonderful thing about the design of these whole thatch roofing sections is that you don't have to do any crazy shenanigans to join them together and make bigger roofs. They all slot together perfectly. You just don't put the wooden bar in the middle. So with a bit of glue you can attach the 2 thatch sheets together, and then once again we need to create our thatch ridging. This time we're going to make it from 4 short pieces of thatch to make 1 long piece that will lock the 2 thatch plates together, and then we have the structure of our roof. So then we just need to attach our timber beam cross braces, and then of course we've got another little choice to make. For the cross brace detail pieces on the first building in tutorial number 1, I used the really lovely detailed horse heads because I wanted to make a bit more of a royal, bit more of a flared up building. But this longhouse is going to be a little bit more low key, and so to create some variety and kind of, a nice sort of spread of different details going along across the whole roof line of my city, I'm going to use the much simpler and much plainer timber braces with the simple circle or half circle cutout, which looks really nice for buildings that you want to be a little bit more low key or a little bit more of a worker's building rather than something more royal or important like a stable. So with our main roof all joined together, you can see it is really quite long, and this is where we start to come to our first kind of design options. We could simply grab a whole bunch of walls. There would be 3 of the longest wall sheets joined together, and we could have a really big long dwelling. But big long boxes aren't actually all that dynamic. You kind of just end up not really engaging with them when you're playing. Your models just move around them. So what I'm going to do is create 2 smaller dwellings that slot underneath this one roof line and allow models to move between. So if I just grab the footprint from my very first building and line that up on the left hand side, you can see that if we take the smallest of the wall panel sections, that leaves kind of a nice sort of middle sized space that allows quite a decent amount of units to flow through that gap. So what we're going to do is essentially build like a little shed or a little storehouse that's attached to the same roof line. So I'm going to grab myself 2 of the smallest wall panels, and then of course we'll also need 2 of our longer wall panels to block that off and keep that in line with the footprint. And we're just going to glue that together into a nice little rectangle using the 90-degree timber beam joiners that we used extensively in tutorial 1. You'll see that that locks together really easily, and there we have a nice little storehouse to go at the very end. So to finish off this little storehouse, we of course do need to create a couple of sections of gable on both of those sides so that it's a fully enclosed building and we don't have, kind of holes seeing into the roof line. So we're going to make 2 sections of gable just like we did in the first video and apply that to both sides. If you were trying to be stingy on parts, you probably could not put the second one down on the inside, but as soon as you look from, the kind of lower angle, you're going to notice, and I want these buildings to be perfect. So then we've got a lovely little complete storehouse, which is going to hold up the right-hand side of our roof line. I've chosen with this building to just use a few kind of different aesthetic choices as well to help create all of that variety. So you'll notice with the gable pieces, you can decide whether those timber slats or timber planks in the gable are horizontal or vertical. I usually like to do them horizontal because I like the contrast between the vertical ones on the lower level and the gable, which is what I did on my first building, but I decided to swap that around and have all vertical planking here on this longhouse for a little bit of variation. I've also chosen to use different wall pieces to my first building. I've now completely rebuilt the other structure, which is basically identical to the first building we built in part 1, but I've used some different textural elements. I've got the kind of wooden barn door windows instead of the nicer glass iron windows, and kind of those timber slots as well. Just, this is a bit more of a rural, a bit more of a working building, rather than the kind of royal household we built earlier. I've also chosen an extra door position to go on one of the shorter ends of the main building. That way I can have a doorway that comes out into the little corridor space between the main building and the storehouse, and I've also got the traditional door on the left hand side so that we can create a nice little porch. Now, if you remember from the last video, I actually had another 2 porches built so I could show you guys all the different porch options, and they're going to be perfect for this building because they're a little bit more rural. We have the semi-enclosed porch that has walls and then an open face with the horsehead detailing, and then we have the fully open porch, which is just held up with some posts and a couple of extra bits of horse detailing. So what I'm going to do is use the semi-enclosed one on our traditional L door position, which is where we have that door on the main building, and we'll mount that in using the exact same techniques where we create an extra bit of angled roof line, as well as allowing that lock-in position for the roof to still be removable. And then what I'm going to do is grab our fully open porch and I'm going to put that at the very front of the storehouse, which creates a really nice extra detail, because, you know, you'd have a bit of an eave as you're kind of pulling tools in and out of the storehouse. It looks really great visually, and it also kind of accentuates the roof line here that is basically forming a little bit of an L. Now, assembling the porch in the L position is very simple. It's exactly the same as what we did in the other video, so I won't dive into that like crazy. We just use our 2 locking planks to slot the porch hard up against the main structure, which allows our roof to slot in, and make sure you do align it up with those grooves on the roof, and that way your roof is going to slot in beautifully, and that will help you locate the exact position of where to put your porch mounting to the wooden paneling on the wall structure. For mounting our porch to the front of the storeroom, however, there are a few little different techniques because we're mounting to a perfectly flat surface now. So we're obviously not going to need to add any roofing. We're just going to keep those 2 triangular prism components of the thatch. We don't need to add any extra triangles because we're not meeting a sloping roof. We're going up against a hard surface. But what we do need to do is trim down all of the plastic flanges that we have on those roofing components so that we've got a completely flush surface. And you'll also notice that the timber beams, which are attached to the horsehead posts, which create the support when they're meshing with an angled roof, do need to be cut down so that they're completely flush. It's actually quite handy to do this once you've assembled it, because that way you can see the exact positioning of where you need to cut. I like to kind of score it out with a small scalpel and then come in with a big hobby knife and just really lean on it, because it is pretty sturdy plastic, but if you get a sharp knife, it's going to look fantastic. Once you've trimmed all of those flanges, including the tongue and groove on the thatch roofing, just come in with a file and really smooth it all down, and that way it's going to look fantastic. And then what we're actually going to do here is I'm going to glue this roof to the porch. We had these elements removable, of course, because they would be lifted off with the main roof in one of the normal building designs, but because this roof component is actually affixed to the wall and it's not attached to that main roof, we're just going to have this permanently glued to the structure of the storehouse. So once that roof is glued down, just grab a little bit more glue and attach it to the back of the thatching and also the timber beams, and then just line everything up on a flat surface. Don't try and glue this in the air because you won't get it level. Make sure everything's level and then just push the components together. You may need to lean the gabling in just a little bit because sometimes it doesn't sit fully straight when it glues on its own. It does have the bracing there, but just make sure you get a really nice firm join, because obviously when you're using this open porch, there's not a lot of contact points because you don't have those side walls there, so you really want to make sure you get a strong connection to the gable. Now, our next building is all about playability, but we're going to step back down to a smaller scale and show you guys something that you can do with basically a very similar footprint, or it seems so at first, as the very stock normal building out of one kit, but this has got a huge twist. So this is essentially designed to be like a little bit of a blacksmith, but it's going to be very open and very playable. Now the main component of the blacksmith is essentially a square. Now you could build this just by grabbing 4 kind of normal wall panels and joining them together, but obviously that wouldn't be enterable. So what we're going to be doing is using 2 normal wall sections and gluing those together to make the kind of 2 back solid walls, and then I'm going to be creating some openable doors by using the pieces from our porch side walls, and cutting those down and modifying them quite extensively to be able to make them into a main wall that has a big gap in the middle, which we can then attach a regular porch to. So what you need to do is take a regular porch panel and then cut a single timber plank off either side, and that makes it a little bit thinner and keeps the window in the center. But you'll notice these pieces are actually a little bit taller than the normal wall pieces, so you're going to need to cut off that timber beam that runs across the top. Once you've done that, and take your time, use the score lines of the planks and kind of really lean into it with a sharp knife. It does take a little bit of muscle, but it's fine and it works pretty well. Make sure you file it all down so it's nice and smooth. And then what you can do is start to join them into the building. So I've made my first one here, and I'm going to affix it to a regular normal wall panel that forms one of the back walls. So grab a 90-degree joiner, glue it up, and then what you'll notice, of course, is because we've cut apart this porch piece, is it doesn't have a tongue and groove anymore. So you're going to need to make sure that you get glue on all of the flat surfaces that are going to be joining, and you can see that starts to build a little wall. I've got one of my porches there, which will show you how that's all going to come together. So what we're going to do now is create the rest of the back wall just by grabbing another 90-degree angle joiner and a normal panel piece. You can see that I'm using some of the kind of fancier windows here because this is the blacksmith and stuff he'd like to be able to see outside, but that also keeps our really straight flat timber paneling on the inside, which will be good later on if we want to do any actual blacksmith furniture detailing in a later video. So what I've done here is I've grabbed another one of those cut down porch side panel pieces, and we're going to do the exact same thing to essentially make a mirror and glue that onto the other side. So I've now got the 2 main sections of the back wall and now 2 smaller sections of those other 2 walls. Now what we need to do here is create the opposing corner to finish off our square. So I've made another of those 2 side porch pieces, cut them down, and then glued them together using another 90-degree angle joiner. So there we can see the footprint of our building with 2 enclosed sides and 2 open sides, one for a porch and one continuing out into our blacksmith's workshop. Up next, we're going to grab 2 pieces of gable and attach them to our wall structure. This is really great because it gives us essentially an element that locks together that open side that isn't going to have a porch. So we can have all elements of the building completely glued together. So if you don't want to have this kind of permanently glued onto a base, it's still going to be really locked together. So run a little bit of glue across the top of those wall porch pieces that have been made into the thinner section of the open wall, and then put a little bit of glue on the gable, and make sure you do get a strong bond there, because obviously this is pretty much the only element that's binding those pieces. So now it's time for our porch. Now you could use any of the 3 porches. I've decided to go for the semi-enclosed version because obviously we need it to be open so that we can move inside into the blacksmith area, but I also wanted those side porch walls just to create a little bit more of a kind of physical substance to the building, because we've reduced the walls and the actual physical line of sight blocking element of the terrain so much. It just helps it kind of have a bit more presence on the battlefield. Building the porch is exactly the same as if you were joining it to the side of the buildings. You still use the little slot, tongue and groove elements that help it glue into the building and keep the roof line locking in appropriately. But what you are going to be doing is gluing onto the smaller wall sections, and there'll be a little bit of an overhang. So make sure you put a small seam of glue on the actual building itself and then attach your porch to that. And just make sure that when you're gluing it together, obviously these are 2 separate elements, so you don't want to accidentally glue it so that you've shrunk or expanded the wall. So just grab a normal wall panel and check that you've spaced everything appropriately, and that way you won't have a building that isn't quite square. The final touch for the main structure of the blacksmith is to just grab one of those planks that you cut from one of the small porch walls and slot that in up under the gable in the second open doorway. So there we can see the main structures come together and looks absolutely fantastic with that roof line there. Now what you could do if you wanted to was attach another bit of gable that's going onto the front, but I've decided to leave that open, and first we're going to set up the blacksmith's working area that sits out underneath the roof line. And to do that, we're going to use a component we haven't even talked about. There's a couple of other wonderful things on this sprue, and some of those are some lovely fencing. So what I'm going to do is grab myself 2 of the fencing sections from one sprue and just clean them all up. They've got a lot of rounded detail that is attached to the sprue, so make sure when you're filing and trimming you don't accidentally take any of that timber detail off. And then what we need to do is cut down the fence so that it's the exact size of one of our shorter wall panels, because of course that's how much distance is left from the main structure to where the beam should be to catch up into the roof line. So trim that all down. You can line it up against one of the small panels to make sure that you get the right distance. The easiest way to cut down the fence is to just grab yourself some side cutters and snip away all the different beams, keeping the flat side of the clippers towards the components that you want to keep. And you've also got a bit of a kind of thick dirt mound underneath, which you'll need to splice as well. Now, of course, what are we gluing this fencing to? We need to create some beams to catch the roof line. So what I've done here is just built some of the same beams that you use from the fully open porch, which is by grabbing a 90-degree angle joiner and gluing 2 of the horse head supports in on either side, which gives us some lovely little kind of detailing as well, because of course this is a stable, because of course this is a blacksmith, so there's lots of horseshoes made here. We all know the Rohan love their horses. So what we're going to do is grab our super glue and drop a couple of dollops on each of the little beam joiners and glue that directly to the main structure of the house, and then do the exact same thing on the other side and glue that to our pillar. Now, I've decided to have the horse heads kind of sticking out away from the roof line and also over, kind of, you know, creating a nice little decoration pointing in towards each other as you walk through the main entrance to the blacksmiths. So once you've completed that on both sides, you'll see now you've kind of got a bit of an option, because those 2 fence elements and those posts with the horse heads are just hanging out in the open space and they're not very secure. And of course, from a structural engineering point of view, there would of course be a cross beam going across the top. Now you could just grab another piece of Gable and glue that in. I didn't really want to do that, not only because it uses more pieces than I really wanted to, but also it kind of takes away from the open element and kind of, you know, it ruins the feng shui, as we say. You know, I want to be able to see in and see that it's a really open space rather than having another big block there. Otherwise, on the battlefield from a distance, it just looks exactly the same as a normal house. So what I'm going to do is actually just make a crossbeam out of a piece of timber. Now, this isn't balsa wood. This is like a kind of modeling hardwood, which is why I'm cutting it with my razor saw, which is really great because it's firm and it takes detail in a really similar way to this sort of plastic. So once I've cut it down to size using my big hobby knife, I'm just going to grab the end of my file or the end of my scalpel or even a really kind of sharp tipped pen and just kind of work a whole bunch of wood grain into this structure, mimicking the exact same sort of patterns that we have on the lowest timber beam of the gable piece. It is also important that when you cut this beam down that you have that slope that matches the slope of the gable. It's probably about 45 degrees, I think, just on either side, because of course your roof is going to want to slot down on top of that timber beam. Now once you've got that all cut down and you're happy with the way the wood grain looks, we're going to glue this to the plastic using super glue, a cyanoacrylate gel super glue, rather than the plastic glue, because of course plastic glue only works with plastic on plastic, and we're joining plastic to timber or wood, so we need to get that super glue in there and just use a fair bit to make sure you get a really strong join across those horse heads and the beam as well. So I've knocked up the rest of the roofline and gone for the less ostentatious cross brace pieces, because this is a bit more of a lower key building, being a kind of working building, but we've still got a little bit of horsehead imagery in there as well coming off the posts, so I'm really happy with how this guy has turned out. Now our third building is going to be an absolute classic Rohan building, which is actually a little bit tricky to make with this kit, which is kind of a little bit frustrating. Essentially what we want to do is make that kind of quintessential L-shaped Rohan dwelling. It could be a Mead Hall, it could just be someone's house, but essentially you've got that big L shape with 2 roof lines of equal size joining together. So the first thing we're going to do is make our footprint. Now this is a very simple footprint to build. It's essentially a big square with a corner that's being cut away, forming an L, so we just join all of our components together, making our longer sections, which are 1 long panel and 1 short panel, joined together with our 180-degree timber beam braces, and then we use 90-degree timber beam braces to make all of our corners. Obviously, we've got the inside corner there as well, so, you know, it just goes to show how great this system is. It's so simple that you can flip the beams around and go inwards with those joins as well as outwards. They're a really fantastic, simple locking system. I've chosen to go back to our our fancier windows because I think this building is going to be a little bit more impressive with its fancier roofline once we get there, but just go through and knock all of those components together and you'll have a really nice looking L shape. Definitely make sure this building's all square because you've got so many kind of different joins with all the 180-degree joiners. It can be really easy for this to get a little bit wonky, so make sure it dries nice and square and glue your gabling onto the main structure. Now, to create the L-shaped roofline, it starts off pretty simple. We just build a normal roof structure, but you'll notice as I try and drop it down, it doesn't actually sit flush now because of the extra walls that are jutting out to make the L. We need to kind of cut away some thatchy grooves and rip those all up so that they slot over nicely. So just grab your clippers, mark out where exactly in the center those beams drop underneath the thatch, and just hack away until you create a nice kind of big gouge in the thatch. The great thing about the thatch is you can wreck it really kind of easily, and it's not really all that obvious because it's thatch. Particularly if you do a big bad job, you can come back and fix it up with a bit of green stuff super easily. You'll need to shave a little bit of the underside of the roof as well, where the timber beam goes, and then once you've got it sitting there all perfectly, it will slot on nice and easily. Now, to create our other L-shaped roofing, we're going to use our normal thatch panels that are full size, but of course we're going to have to cut them down. So the first thing we're going to do is grab a piece of normal gable and glue that to the remaining wall face that is going to be supporting the roof. Get that all locked in because that's going to help us measure the exact perfect length of thatch. Although I say exact, watch me stuff this up and have to fix it, but that's okay. It's very, very easy to do, and it is a little daunting because we're of course cutting pieces here, right? We are literally full on modifying. We're off the instruction manual, so it seems a little scary, but as long as you measure it all, it's totally fine. So we know that the thatch roof lines up perfectly with the exact position on the gable before the timber beam frontage is attached. So we can measure that to the front of the gable and then mark the top of the center line where the roof thatch meets the other ridge from the first roof piece, and we can mark that as the top. And then what we can do is just cut down the piece of thatch so we've got the right size rectangle that's going to be appropriate, and then we can just chuck away that extra spare piece for another modification. So what I'm going to do is mark that with a permanent marker using a bit of a straight rule from that mark off the center line. Make sure you double check it once you've ruled it, and then grab yourself a modeling saw or a razor saw and just work back and forth slowly through the plastic. It cuts really easily, it's nice and soft, and then you have a cut down roof which is the right length. But now of course we need to create the angle that allows this piece of roof to join with the main roofing structure. But of course we know exactly what that angle is because it's the exact same angle as our roof line. So what we can do is lay down our piece of trimmed down thatch and take our existing roof structure, line the apex of that roofing structure up at the top corner of the roof that's going to be slanting down to the triangle, and then the sloping roof that's there will create a lovely line that we can just mark out with a permanent marker, and that's going to give us the perfect mesh point where those roofing panels will join. So once again, just double check everything, grab your razor saw and cut your way through that. Now, if you do what I did and accidentally draw badly and don't get the angle quite right, don't worry too much because we're going to be fixing all of this join with green stuff anyway, and I'll show you a little cheat on how to repair it. I basically cut mine too short, and you'll see in a sec there's a bit of a gap, so we'll have to fill that in. Do the exact same thing on your other side, or when you're happy and you've got your two components that are all meshed perfectly, you can join those together nice and easily. Grab yourself a normal half section of roof ridging, and that will glue it together. Now, of course, we're going to have to cut ourselves down a piece of ridging as well, so just, you know, get that all in there and measure it up. Again, hacking with your modeling saw. Now, that ridging is, of course, going to need to mesh on an angle as well, so you can just do this by eye and grab your clippers and clip off the bottom corner of that final point of edging so that it meshes all smoothly with the main roof structure. So now I've got the ridging and the roof panels working well. What I've done is I've gone back to my excess piece of roofing that I cut from the first kind of sheet, and I've just cut an extra little sliver and then glued that back, basically adjusting my original cut by a little bit, just so I've got a little bit of filler there. Now obviously it's not going to look perfect because it has already been cut once, so there'll be a line down the roofing panel which you can see, so we'll just have to repair and cover that up with green stuff as we go. Now that I'm happy with this kind of additional roofing panel, I'm going to glue that in place and lock it all down, get it in position, obviously just gluing it to the roof, not gluing it to the building, so it can still be fully removable, and then we're going to come in with some green stuff once that is fully dry and start to patch all of those joins, and soon you will see two wonderfully seamless L-shaped roofs with no join to be seen. So green stuff, if you haven't used it before, I'm sure you all have, it's just a blue-yellow compound that you mix up 50-50, rub it nice and firmly until it's green, and then I'm going to draw that out into a long strand and jam hammer that into the joints, and then the great thing about green stuff is it's really easy to move around as long as you've got a little bit of water on your blade to stop your blade or your tools from sticking to the green stuff. So once you've jammed it in there, put a bit of water on your scalpel and start to kind of really shape it around. Now the thatch is super easy to sculpt. I'm not like, you know, the best sculpting teacher or anything, but it's really easy to do because it's all just lines basically. So just have a play. You want to kind of balance the lines coming in both directions as the two roofing structures are meeting, but most of the lines are going to be from the newer section of roof because that one's coming down on top. So you're kind of mostly kind of extending the plastic that's there on the new roof and meshing it with the existing roof, but occasionally you can do a couple little extra added bits of green stuff from the existing roof structure. There's a few little tricky bits around the top of the roof when you're getting the ridging to kind of mesh, because the ridging pattern is quite an interesting set of kind of, well, ridges, bumps and grooves of thatch that kind of curve perfectly. So just roll yourself almost like a little sausage across the top of the ridging and then kind of pat it down flat until you're happy with the overall shape of how it's replicating the shape of that ridging. And then once you've got that shape locked down, get a bit of water on the blade and then start to sculpt. You know, just draw your scalpel across the top of the ridge, creating line, line, line. But the great thing is, of course, you're mimicking a structure or a texture that's already there, so it's really easy to kind of just step and repeat and copy until it blends, getting smaller and smaller, and blends with the ridging that's there from the original roof. Now on the other panel I had a little bit more work to do because there were some big holes left over and obviously that huge big seam of the original cut, so I just got a little bit more green stuff and jammed that all in. And honestly, once I pushed those kind of bits of plastic together, a lot of the original cuts sort of disappeared, which was lucky, but for the areas that were obvious I just got a tiny little slither of green stuff and just made it look like a few thatch bumps. It's a really forgiving texture to be sculpting with, and you'll see that it comes out pretty well. So there we have it, another little building. I'm going to call this one the Mead Hall for now, and as you can see, it's nothing massive or nothing grand, but it illustrates a really great technique that you can use to create some really interesting roof lines. You could certainly do this on a bigger scale with a much bigger building and get a really interesting result as well, and that might be something that I try in the future, but really happy with how this guy's turned out. And now we have the Rohan Stables. This building took roughly 3 kits and is a really nice centerpiece for your Rohan village, but isn't as kind of huge or imposing as any of the big Golden Hall builds that are possible as well, but it's still a really fantastic build that looks great on the table and is really optimized for gameplay. It has a really good kind of balance of exploring the techniques of optimizing the footprint and the roofline, and it's also enterable as well, which is going to be fantastic for gameplay. Now, as you can see straight away, it is 2 levels. There is a little small upper level, which is just a simple square to create some extra elevation and change that roofline, but for starters, we're just going to look at the lower level, which is basically an even longer L. So we've got some really long walls here, which are all just made up of the same different panels, the long panels and the short panels, which are all joined together with 180-degree joiners. Once again, because you're making these long walls with all these kind of flexible points where the joins are, make sure that you glue it all together, lay it out straight, and that way you won't have, well, you won't have as much chance of it kind of bending and warping as you're in the middle of gluing things. If you can, build all the flat walls and let them glue for like an hour or something first, before kind of going on and messing with them. And then just grab yourself some 90-degree angle joiners and build in all your corners to create a lovely L shape, but don't lock it in on the ends, leave those open because we're going to make this building enterable as well. So I'm going to do a slightly different technique this time than using the side porch panels. I'm just going to use one of our existing door panels and I'm just going to cut them down to size. Now the great thing about these door panels is if you cut in the exact right place, you can just get rid of the door and have an opening which is still perfectly suitable for a porch to join. But before we do that, let's dive into getting our porches ready. Now I'm going to go back to using the traditional porch design where we have the side panels and the lovely ornate door, but what I'm going to do is cut that door out so instead it becomes a lovely ornate arch. Now I'm going to grab myself a cutting mat here so I don't put any more holes in my table, and I'm going to cut these door components out, obviously while they're still separate, don't glue them together. Now what we want to do is grab a nice big hobby knife and work on the straight section, really dig in, make sure that you don't accidentally shave off the hinge, which juts out a little bit over the timber plank, so just focus on the bottom bit and really kind of kneel into it, lean into it, and get your blade sinking through that plastic, working from both sides. You can bend and flex the door back and forth and start to really wear that down. Then grab a small scalpel and gently follow the curve around, slowly scoring away at that curve across the top of the door, making sure that you don't do it on an angle. Don't angle your blade or you'll accidentally carve off some of that gorgeous ornate cross-hatching detail that goes across the top of the door. We don't want to lose any of that because it looks absolutely stunning. And then what you want to do is kind of just get your thumb and your forefinger in there and just bend it back and forth until eventually it will just snap right out really easily along those score lines, and then you can just bring your knife in and kind of shave that all down and smooth up the surface where the plastic has torn or snapped, and then you've got yourself a nice simple little archway. So do that on both sides. When you glue it together, you obviously want to make sure you get a nice contact point up on that kind of overlapping plate and the beam join as well, because there's less kind of gluing points now because you've gotten rid of the door, and then you can just go ahead and make your normal porch, attaching your side pieces, and you're good to go. Now let's make our door panels. We need this porch to mount somewhere, of course, so what we're going to do is go back to our big juicy scalpel or modeling knife, and we're going to hack away at certain panels. Now what we want to do here is flip the door panel over so that we get those two window slots on either side, and then what we want to do is cut down the line of the plank immediately to the left or right on the inside side of that window, and that way you're still going to get to see your window, which is going to look quite good on the stable entrance, and it's also going to be the perfect size for the porch to mesh. This is the exact same thing as cutting any other plastic components. Just slowly score. You won't really be able to score from both sides because the panels or the planks don't line up exactly on that design, which is frustrating, but just dig through gently from one side and spend time cutting that timber beam from the top as well, and then give it all a big file to smooth it all down, and then she's going to look absolutely fantastic. Now to attach these shortened wall panels, we just grab ourselves another 90-degree angle joiner and glue it on both sides. Luckily with this system or this technique, as opposed to the one that we used in the Blacksmith, you do still have your tongue and grooves there, so it's very easy to join. Now the next thing we're going to do is attach our pieces of gable, and the great thing about this is of course it locks it all together and attaches our now two floating wall pieces of the L, because of course the gable goes across the top. You only want to put the glue on the sides of the gable, don't leave it on the center, because obviously it's going to be gluing to nothing, and then you can just grab yourself an extra long piece of wall panel and line that up to make sure that you've glued it in the right spot. But as long as you get the gable positioned centrally, the gable support beam should lock that in for you. Once your gable's down, you can finish off the porch, once again gluing down the small roof structure to the top of the archway like we did in the Longhouse earlier today, and of course you do need to remember to file down those tongue and groove elements and then glue that straight to the front of the gable and the timber paneling there that's been reduced in size, and that will line up quite nicely. It's really easy because you just get the center of the gable and line that up with the center of the porch, and then it's all going to glue perfectly in the right spot. So now we have our lower level finished, it's time to start working on the upper level and the roof line. The first thing we're going to do is build the second story because it's super easy. It's just a box, you know, you guys have built a million of these panels now, I'm sure you can cope with that, and that's just going to drop on the center. Now that isn't going to get glued down, I'm just going to have that as part of the roof line so it's fully removable. The one thing you do need to do when you're building that upper level is make sure you've got two sides that are solid plank, no windows, facing down the roof lines of the two wings of the L. Otherwise you're going to have a thatch roof coming up against half a window, and that's going to look pretty stupid. So just build yourself two normal thatch roof sections, but leave off the timber support beams, the cross braces on one end, because those pieces are going to be perfectly flush to line up with our second story. That's the great thing about this kit being so well designed, is if you just drop those beams off, you don't have to cut the thatch down or anything. It's the absolute perfect size. What you do need to do is file down the tongue and groove, of course, on the side that's going to be coming up flush with the second story, but it's, you know, it's really simple stuff. I've also obviously gone with the horse heads for this design because it's a stable, y'all, so yeah, horse heads are going to be absolutely perfect. Now, to make sure that these roof structures join perfectly, the first thing we're going to need to do is grab our clippers and just cut away a tiny corner of thatch on the inside join, so that those roofs can kind of come together. You don't have to worry about it if it's too rough, once again we'll come back in with a bit of green stuff and fix that up. So just get it out of the way for the time being until it sits there perfectly. And then the other thing we want to do before we glue these roofs to the second story is come in with our modeling knife and our file, and we want to reduce the profile of any contact point with any of the timber beams. On the wall paneling, obviously the planks and the timber beams are at slightly different relief or slightly different depth. So on the top of the ridged thatch, you need to file that down a little bit, and also on the sides, where the sides of the second story come in contact with the thatch, you need to carve out a little groove as well. And then once you've got that all flush and you can feel it locking nicely, make sure you keep the thatch kind of, because there's no gable there, right? Make sure it's not bowing out to the sides. It's got the little locking points on the lower sides of the thatch, so just keep that locked to the walls of the first level. Once that is all meshing nicely, just get a whole bunch of glue and glue both of those sides in with the second story. Make sure you glue the little cutaway point where the two thatch components touch each other from the two roofs, and then you'll have a really strong join. Now I would advise letting that really glue before you start messing with the final roofing element, otherwise you could knock it quite easily. Now, the final roof of our buildings today is a really cool little roof that is cut down from a full-size piece of thatch. What I'm going to do is just throw up my two pieces of gable. Now they can go either way depending on what you want, it doesn't really matter. I've just chosen to run them in that direction, and then just grab a piece of thatch and you can measure it off and cut on the exact point where the piece of thatch overhangs the second gable, because of course we know that the cross braces line up perfectly in line with that level, so you know it's just so easy to know where everything lines up. It's really well designed. Once you've cut that down, just grab yourself your cross braces and glue those to the sides. Now it is going to be a little tricky obviously, because one of those sides, the one that you've cut, doesn't have a tongue and groove, so you will either need to file down the tongue or don't use the tongue, you know, cut the side that doesn't, and just get a fair bit of glue in there and hold it firm. But once you get the horsehead cross brace detail piece in there, it'll really lock it down. You'll obviously need to cut down your ridging, your thatch ridging, to be the right size as well, but that's super easy to measure, and it all comes together really easily. Get your horses in there, get it all glued up nicely, and it's going to look absolutely fantastic. Now there is a little trick, of course, because this roof is sitting down over a thatched corner that's coming right up to the timber surface. You're going to need to take a chunk out of that roof to get it to mesh properly, which we'll be able to repair and lock all up with green stuff in a sec. And then what I'm actually going to do is glue this roof down. If you wanted to, you could build like an upper story with some floorboards, but I don't really see that ever kind of coming into play in terms of gameplay, so I've just decided to lock it all together as one roof piece that lifts off and not have the upper story as playable, but you certainly could do that if you wanted to. And there we have our roof line almost finished, but what we want to do now is just add a little bit more detail and a little bit more balance to the roof line by creating some of our small roof line pieces with the lovely small pieces of gable. I've chosen the cool little sun crests as well to get some more Rohan heraldry in there. Now what we want to do here is you'll notice these the small triangle pieces of thatch are optimized to lock in on two positions on the normal thatch roofing, but because we've messed up that and moved it all around, they don't lock in. So just kind of file down the underside of that thatch so that it's much easier to glue down, and that means you'll get a lower profile join, which will be less kind of filling for you with green stuff. So once you file down that underside, get a whole bunch of glue on there and just press it in place, because it won't lock in and hold itself until the glue grabs. Give it 20 seconds, and then do that on the other side as well, and you'll have two lovely little roof lines that create quite a nice shape to that top roof. Now the final stage for this building, she's almost finished, is just to go back in the exact same way that we did with the last building and fix up all those joins that we've modified with a bit of green stuff. There's obviously a couple of tricky ones here. You've got the big kind of hole in the thatch where the ridging has been cut away for that final roofing element, so just grab a big clump of green stuff and chuck that up in there. As always, just keep a bit of water on your scalpel blade, and that'll be really easy to work around and create a nice kind of flowing lump of thatch. I ended up using a whole bunch of the offcuts that I made from the first building, because this roof thatch is so covered by all the other thatch components that come on top of it. It was a great place to get away with kind of jamming in a whole bunch of roofy offcuts and then finishing it off with green stuff, and you'll never know the difference when it's painted. And there we have a fantastic looking stable with a really interesting roofline that's enterable, it's playable, it creates a nice shape on the battlefield, and is going to be really fantastic for gameplay. So look at this little Rohan city, guys. Isn't it starting to take shape? We've got quite a few kits here on the table so far. Each of these kind of small buildings are essentially one kit, and then our longhouse is pretty much 2 kits, and then of course we've got the big piece in the center, which is our stable, and that is 3 kits. So we're really looking at about 8 kits here on the table, which leaves me 4. I've got 4 left to do one kind of big special project piece, and then I'm going to probably need to buy like another stronghold's worth, maybe another 2 strongholds, because my god, I'm addicted to these kits. They are fantastic, and you can really do some crazy stuff with them when you're not afraid to grab a modeling saw and a bit of a scalpel and start hacking and chopping, get a bit of green stuff in there. When you're not so constrained by the original intended purposes, you can go, yeah, really quite crazy. I think, as we discussed, the key is roof lines, the key is floor plans, the key is mixing it up as much as possible so that you don't have 15 of that same building on the box, and you can get a really, really lovely kind of authentic and realistic looking Rohan village that is going to be fantastic for gameplay as well as really easy on the eye. Let me know if you guys liked these particular builds, and we've obviously got a couple of very special videos coming up. I'm going to do some really nice builds where I take you in depth through the entire build step by step for some very special buildings. I'm thinking the Rohan Royal Stables, and of course Metacell itself. That is going to be so much fun. Yeah, let me know what you think of these builds. If you have any other suggestions on different build techniques you'd like to see me try, drop them down in the comments below. And make sure you jump over to our Zorpazorp community Facebook page, which I'll actually link in the description this time instead of forgetting, and share all the photos of the buildings you're building. I want to see what you guys are making, and it's such a great way to feed off each other and steal everyone's ideas. Obviously, we haven't even touched the Palisade kits yet, so that's still coming. And also, I want to do a bit of a focus, like a special video on integrating the Palisade kit and the houses to build some really cool kind of like in-city sort of fortified kind of watchtowers, or maybe like make a barracks or an armory, so it's got a little bit of that like defensive kind of architecture as well as building elements. So there's lots of really cool stuff left to do with these kits. I could just make like 100 videos on these. I won't, because you guys will probably get sick of it. Maybe not. Kits are pretty good. But there is so much more coming. Make sure you subscribe if you're new around here, and if you haven't seen our other Rohan House tutorial or any of our other War in Rohan content, make sure you check that out, and check out all the Middle-earth goodies we've got here on the channel. If you want to support us, head on over to Patreon. We've got some amazing rewards there for our new Patreon supporters, and we're about to launch our new live stream, which will be the next Monday now, because my capture card didn't arrive. But that's coming very soon, and that has some amazing rewards tied to it for our Patreon supporters, so exciting stuff there. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time right here on Zorpazorp Gaming. Cheers, guys. This is gonna kill me. This is so hard. Why am I doing this stupid gag? Blacksmith, stables, longhouses. Blacksmith, stables, longhouses. We put the new blacksmith, stables, longhouses. We check the new push mark. It's too hard to do both.